What is happening, everyone? Welcome back to episode 20 of Manny's Food Channel. It's your boy Manny, aka Mr. Cooking It Up. And for this episode, I was really craving some pasta, but it's no ordinary pasta. It's a lobster ravioli with a very simple lobster cream sauce. Now, there's not a lot of ingredients or prep to do for this recipe, but as always, it's going to taste absolutely delicious. So without further ado, let's get down to business. Okay, so to start off this dough, I have some all-purpose flour here. Now there's only a couple of ingredients, and contrary to what some people might think, making pasta is extremely easy. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of build a little well in the middle, so that way I can pour my eggs in it. And there's only a couple of ingredients in this recipe. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to dump the eggs in. Next up, I'm going to add in a touch of olive oil. Around 1 tablespoon. A little bit of salt, just to enhance the flavor of the pasta dough. And then finally, I'm going to add some saffron. Now this is an optional step. It's completely up to you whether or not you want to add saffron in it. But the reason why I'm adding saffron is because it adds a bit of flavor, and also it changes the color a little bit. So adds the nice yellow and reddish color to the pasta. So now what I'm going to do is first I'm going to start off by slowly whipping up the eggs in the middle, and little by little incorporate the flour into the egg mix until the dough starts to form. Then we're going to start kneading it. So now at this point, the dough is starting to form. You might have a little bit of excess flour on your board, but that's not a big deal. Just continue to knead and incorporate as much flour as you can without it becoming overly thick. If you feel that your dough is starting to become thick, remove any of the excess flour that's on your board, so that way it doesn't become very thick. You want a very nice and smooth dough. But continue to knead your dough for at least 5 minutes until you have a very nice smooth dough. Then I'm going to put it in a bowl with a little bit of olive oil, and then wrap it up, leave it at room temperature so that it can proof for at least 1 hour. And then in the meantime, we can move on to making the lobster ravioli filling. So while the dough is resting, we're going to move on to our lobster filling for the ravioli. Now, first what we're going to do is we're going to finely chop some shallots and grate a couple cloves of garlic. And then we're going to quickly sweat them off, cool them down, and then add them to our filling. And the reason why we're cooking them off first is because we want to remove any of the raw flavor that comes from the shallots and the garlic. We want the filling to be very mild in flavor because the star of the dish is going to be the lobster. So we're just going to finely chop the garlic and shallots. So now we're going to quickly sweat off the shallots and garlic. I'm just going to add in a touch of extra virgin olive oil, or you can use regular olive oil as well. And then we're going to make sure that we coat the whole pan with the oil. And the first thing we're going to cook off is the shallots. And we're going to sweat this off for a couple minutes until the shallots become really translucent. And then we'll add in the garlic. And once that's done, we'll put this mix in the fridge to cool off for a couple minutes before we add it into our lobster ravioli mix. So the lobster ravioli filling is pretty straightforward. What I have here is a combination of claws and the leg meat. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roughly chop it. Make sure you don't chop it too fine because you still want some of that texture inside the filling. And you want to be able to identify the lobster in the filling as well. So I'm going to give this a rough chop. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna zest half a lemon. I'm gonna grate some Parmesan. Throw in some chili flakes. Some Mascarpone Cheese. Now you can use ricotta cheese as well. The reason why I'm using Mascarpone Cheese is because I had some left over from last week. And it's got a very nice creamy flavor to it, which is why I added the Mascarpone Cheese instead of ricotta, but you can certainly add ricotta in there as well. Next, I'm gonna add in the sauteed garlic and shallots. Now we're gonna start folding these in together. Now at this point, if you like to add some herbs, you can add any kind of herbs you want, such as parsley. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add some dried dill. And finally, don't forget to season the filling, because once you put in the ravioli, obviously you can't season it. So we're gonna add in some salt and freshly cracked black pepper. And we're gonna fold this in. If you feel it needs a little bit of acidity and you like a little bit of acidity, add a little bit of lemon juice into the mix. Otherwise, let this sit in the fridge, and then we'll move on to working on the ravioli sauce. So because we're going to strain the sauce once it's halfway cooked, you don't have to be very technical about how you cut your shallots, garlic, carrots, and celery. You can just rough chop them. So I'm just gonna roughly chop all of these veg. So before we start sauteing all our veg, one thing I want to talk about are the shells here. So what I did with the lobsters, I extracted all the meat from the shells, and then I put the shells in the oven and roasted them on 450 degrees for probably around 10 minutes or so, just so I could dry out the shells and kind of extract some of that flavor and a bit of smokiness from the shells. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add it to our sauce, and then continue to extract some of that flavor while it's simmering in the sauce, and then we're going to strain it out. So to start off, I'm going to saute the shallots in a quarter cup of olive oil. Make sure the olive oil is distributed evenly throughout the pan or your pot before you add it in. Next up, we're going to toss in the carrots and celery. So this is like a mini version of a mirepoix mix, but instead of onions, I just used shallots. So now I'm just going to saute this for another couple minutes until it starts to brown just a little bit. And then I'm going to add in the lobster shells. After I sauteed the lobster shells for a couple minutes, then I'm going to toss in the garlic. And then I'm going to cook this off for another 2 to 3 minutes, just so the garlic starts to cook off. And then I'm going to deglaze with white wine. Now basically what deglaze means is to remove any of that extra browning or flavor that's at the bottom of your pot. Now typically, most of the time you use any kind of wine or some kind of alcohol, but if you don't drink, then you can certainly just use the chicken stock or any kind of stock or some kind of liquid to remove that flavor from the bottom of your pan. But in this case, I'm going to use some white wine. Now before I deglaze the pan, I'm just going to add in some tomato paste and brown that out a little bit. And then I'm going to deglaze with the white wine. So now try and scrape off all this extra flavor that are at the bottom of your pan. And reduce the alcohol until it's almost all evaporated. And then we're going to throw in the chicken stock. So I didn't have time to make my own chicken stock, so I just bought the Campbell's non-salted chicken stock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in about 1 liter into this sauce mix, and then I'm going to reduce it to around half. And then at that point we're going to extract all the shells and all the carrots and garlic, strain it off, and then we're gonna add the cream and reduce it. But in the meantime, we're gonna let this simmer for about 45 minutes to an hour, and we're gonna move on to preparing the actual raviolis itself, rolling out the dough and adding in the ravioli filling mix. So whenever you're making ravioli, you wanna make sure that you have everything ready to go before you start. So that way when you're rolling out the dough doesn't dry out. So from left to right, I have my pasta roller. Make sure it's securely attached to your table. So that way when you're rolling it, it doesn't move around too much. And make sure that when we're starting on the pasta setting, we start on the biggest setting and then slowly move to the thinnest one. I have my egg wash for the ravioli. I have a damp paper towel just to cover up the dough that we're not using right away. A brush for the eggs. I have 2 cookie cutters. One of them is bigger than the other. The reason why is because when we put the filling on top, you don't want them to be the same size, because when we put the other half of the ravioli on top, when we put the dough on top, it might be too small for us to crimp and close off the ravioli. So we're gonna put the smaller one at the bottom, then we're gonna put the bigger one on top. I have excess flour just in case I need to flour off or dust off my table. I have a bench scraper just in case. And finally, I have a rolling pin. So to start off, I'm just gonna dust my bench a little bit. Then I'm gonna place my dough on top. Add a little bit of flour so that way it doesn't stick to my board. And the worst thing about rolling dough is if you don't add enough flour, sometimes it sticks to the surface and kind of ruins the shape of your pasta that you're making. So at this point, I'm gonna just cut it in half and deal with half portions rather than dealing with the whole thing. So I'm gonna set this one aside and put it under my damp paper towel. And you can even put it in the saran wrap if you want, just to cover it up, make sure it doesn't dry. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start rolling this to the size of my pasta roller. You don't want it to be too thick, otherwise it doesn't go through. You don't want it to be too thin because otherwise it's gonna be uneven. Make sure that it's within the width or the length of this pasta roller. So I'm just gonna quickly roll it up. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna add a little bit of flour to my pasta roller as well to remove any possibility of the dough sticking to the pasta roller. And basically what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna slowly roll the dough in the pasta roller at the biggest setting. And I'm gonna do this once or 2 times, and then we can move on to slowly moving it into the smaller setting of the pasta dough. Next up, we're going to move it to the next setting. If you feel that you can skip a setting and move 2 settings over, then you can definitely do that. Now, pasta rollers are not expensive. This one here cost me around, I think, $15 to $20. It's a great little tool to have in your kitchen. So at this point, you have 2 options. If you feel that you're quick enough that you can do all the dough at the same time and you can cut it out without the dough getting dry, then you can certainly cut it all out at the same time. But basically what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to show you guys how to do one. So I'm just going to do one of each cookie cutter and cut out the dough. And then do the other one. And I'll set the rest of the dough aside. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add just enough filling where I can still crimp the ravioli without it bursting. And that's the reason why one half of the ravioli dough is bigger than the other, so that when we go to wrap it up, it doesn't burst. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add just a little bit of egg wash just around it. That way it sticks together when we crimp it. And now what I'm gonna do is we're gonna start edge to edge. Start from one side, finish at the other, and then crimp the ravioli. You want to remove any of the air bubbles that are in there as well. here I have one of my raviolis, nicely crimped. All the sides are secured. I removed any excess bubble around it. And now we're going to continue on to make more raviolis until we use up all the dough and all the filling. And then we can start to boil it and continue to work on the sauce. So now this lobster broth has been reducing for about 45 minutes or so. You can see that half of the stock has been reduced and it's starting to thicken up. And I know that I've extracted the maximum amount of flavor, so now it's no point in continuing to simmering it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strain off everything into a different pot. So be careful, everything is going to be really hot. You don't want it to splash back on you. Just strain off all the shells, the garlic, shallots, carrots, celery, and whatnot. And once you've extracted all the broth from this lobster mix, now what we're going to do is I've tempered some whipping cream or some heavy cream, and I'm going to bring this up into a very light simmer, and I'm going to cook this off low and slow until the cream has started to thicken up the broth. And then finally we're going to season it. But in the meantime, I'm going to bring a pot of water to a boil so that'll be ready to cook off our raviolis. So my sauce has been simmering for around 20 minutes to half an hour now. As you can see, it's very smooth, very light velvety texture, and it's reduced probably by around half, I would say. So to finish off the sauce, I'm going to start off by adding just a touch of butter. Give it a bit more richness and shine to the sauce. Next up, I'm going to add a bit of grated Parmesan cheese. You can add more or less depending on how much you like parm in your sauce. And finally, I'm going to add a touch of black pepper and a little bit of salt just to season it up. And just season it to taste. I'm going to give this a quick mix here. And I'm going to let this reduce for probably another 5 minutes or so. But now I'm going to cook the ravioli. So what I'm going to do here is in this pot beside it, I have a little bit of salt and some olive oil, and all I'm going to do is just toss this in and let it boil for around 2 to 3 minutes. The filling is already cooked. All we have to do is just cook the pasta. So once the pasta is cooked, then we can start plating. Now, pasta is not really that hard to make. That's why with this recipe I decided to make a very simple, easy to make pasta, so that way everyone can have an idea as to how to make very simple and basic pasta, and then from there you can always put your own twist. But without further ado, after the taste test, I might have put a little bit too much sauce, but who can complain about sauce when it tastes this delicious? Cheers. Tastes very delicious. Sauce is very rich, very creamy, and that bit of lobsterness just puts the cherry on top. But I hope everyone enjoyed this video. If you did, please like my video and subscribe to my channel. And I look forward to seeing everyone next time.